Thank you. It's exciting to be here today. I've been to many of these seminars, and I'm housed just upstairs on the 4th floor, so I know many of the faces in the room. But I don't actually have a lot of time to discuss our different research projects with each other. So today I'm going to talk about, I'm going to focus on my research which explores the impact of the neighborhood environment on health and well-being through the lens of children. So just a little bit of the agenda of my talk. I will start by discussing the status of international urban health and children's well-being theory, and then contextualizing urban health within a framework of structural violence, and then discussing the international study on children's well-being that I'm a part of, both in South Africa and here in Cleveland. So I really wanted to start with this quote, and this is from the study that I conducted in South Africa, from a female participant. In our place, they can't see what's happening to us. The gangsters are shooting by us, and when they look at our pictures, they will see that this is true, what the children are drawing. And then a male participant said, and they will stand up. And the female participant said, we are not just children, we're also people. So this quote came from a context of Cape Town, South Africa. We may be familiar with some of the quantitative measures on children's well-being, at least more generally looking at sub-Saharan Africa or Africa in general as a continent, where infant mortality is as high in Cape Town as 81 deaths per 1,000 live births. It's high here in Cleveland, but nothing like that. So we see these quantitative measures, and we know that children are facing challenges to their health and their well-being. But what my research tries to do is really contextualize those challenges and really help people to see that they're not just numbers, they're not just children, these are real human beings who deserve the same opportunities as any of us to health and to well-being, whether they're in a township community of Cape Town, and in the inner city of Cleveland, in a suburb of Cleveland, and that's really what my research tries to promote. And on top of it, just the power that we have in academia to really amplify the voices of people who have been historically marginalized throughout the world. So just a little bit about the status of urban health and why it's important. More than half of the world's population live in urban environments, and this is expected to rise to an estimated 67% by 2030, according to the UN Population Fund. So while urban environments provide a lot of extra resources to support health, such as places for recreation, access to health care, opportunities for schooling, there's also a number of growing urban health challenges that we're facing in the field of public health and in psychology. Injuries related to interpersonal violence, automobile crashes, indoor and outdoor air pollution, lead exposure, obesity, depression, and other mental health challenges. So a lot of you in this room are in public health. You're very familiar with these challenges that we're facing, and these are only going to rise, so we need to pay attention to urban contexts. And focus on further contextualizing so we can address some of these issues. A couple of terms that I'm going to speak about today and that my work is largely interconnected to is child health disparities and child health equity. How I define child health disparities is inequitable differences in health based on demographic characteristics of persons under the age of 18. Where my research is heavily focused on trying to create child health equity. So we can see through, especially a lot of the measures in the UN, that child health disparities exist both across countries internationally and within local context as well. So child health equity is children having the same opportunities to survive, develop, and attain their full potential. And this is a goal that we have not just for children in this city, but for children across the world. So a little bit on the status of the world's children. I know this is a little hard to see, but it's just an infographic from UNICEF that captures global child mortality. So we know that disparities in the survival and health prospects of children from different backgrounds exist today. So we can see that in a lot of the information provided by UNICEF. We know that sub-Saharan Africa has the majority of child mortalities in the whole world. We can see that it's also extremely high in India compared to more Western countries in Europe and the United States. What we also know is that this is not random, and that it's also structural in nature. And these disparities systematically follow historical roots of social disadvantage, not only linked to wealth, but also ethnicity, race, education, rural-urban divides, among other factors. So there's been this global interest in studying children's subjective well-being. We know that these quantitative objective measures are really helpful for contextualizing the extent of child health disparities across the world. But what it doesn't do is really pay attention to the context and also how that affects children within that context from their perceptions. So this is very under-researched, but there is a growing movement around this, and this is largely founded in the children's rights movement that's happening internationally, and the leaders in that were the United Nations and the Declaration of the Rights of the Child, which is highly recognized in South Africa and embedded in their constitution. Not so much in the United States, but we still do have a recognition of children's rights, and sometimes and in some places. But whether or not those rights in South Africa are actually being respected is a different thing. And so what the UN Declaration of the Rights of the Child states is really that children have the right to be involved in decision-making related to their lives and well-being, and it really supports child participation, so children actively participating in matters influencing their lives. The new sociology of childhood studies has also really influenced this movement of understanding children's subjective well-being. And this is based on the notion that childhood is a social construction, and that it's based on a lot of cultural assumptions on children's abilities and capabilities. And so while, for example, in the research sector, we have these protections in place to protect children as vulnerable populations, we also may be further marginalizing children, especially in certain contexts, because of this label of their vulnerability. So that's also something to keep in mind as we move forward with children's research. And developmental psychology has made also a lot of movements forward showing that children are actually capable of many cognitive processes and abilities than we used to give them credit for. So I think there's advancements in both clinical and developmental psychology and in new sociology of childhood studies that kind of complement each other. We may have some assumptions based on research at one particular point in time and in one particular context, but children may be constantly challenging those assumptions. And also it may look very different what childhood is in various contexts throughout the world, which we'll see today, kind of looking at South Africa and Cleveland. So this movement led a bunch of researchers to get together, one of whom is my mentor from the University of the Western Cape, to design this international study on children's well-being called Children's World Study. I was a part of the Wave 2 data collection in South Africa. They're now on Wave 3. The initial study had 34,500 children ages 8 to 12 who participated from 14 countries around the world. South Africa was one of those countries. The United States was also one of those countries. So it really was based on trying to get a worldwide understanding of children's subjective well-being through a self-administered questionnaire that really captured children's own perspectives of how they were doing and how they felt and how their health was being supported. There were some challenges, definitely, and especially in trying to translate the survey to many different languages with culturally irrelevant terminology sometimes, challenges with illiteracy when you're doing a survey in rural South Africa where children don't have access to quality education, things like that. So there are things to take into account when interpreting the results. I'm not going to go too much into those results today, but I will say that you can find a lot more information on the website. There's a lot of published reports. We have published the report of South Africa, Wave 2 of the study, and we're working on writing up some other journal articles at the time, and then there's a number of comparative studies published as well. But definitely challenges with comparing survey results from like the United States with South Africa, and also challenges in the sampling process too. In the United States, we are an extremely large country, and the sample is not representative of our entire country. It actually just took place in rural Midwest. So the results you're going to get from rural Midwest communities are going to be very different than urban Cleveland contexts, as just one example. So the main reason I wanted to present a little bit of this is to show how it merged into the qualitative work that I'm going to present in more detail today, but I'm happy to talk about this offline or to refer you to more information. So this study really did shed light on the fact that there are so many contextual differences that are not coming out in this survey, and led to the development of an international qualitative study on children's well-being, and that's called Children's Understanding of Their Well-Being, CWWB. And that was grounded in these 4 basic questions. How can we understand and define child well-being? How can we integrate children's perspectives into research on child well-being? And what does that mean in terms of ethical, theoretical, and methodological approaches? How can we understand children's well-being in the context of extent globalized conditions of growing up? For example, whether there are shared or different meanings and experiences of well-being across national contexts. And how do these differences and commonalities relate to how childhood is constructed and performed in different social contexts? So I'm a part of this study as a co-principal investigator in South Africa, even though I'm based here in Cleveland, and also here in the United States. I'm partnering with someone from the University of South Dakota, Lisa Newland, who is studying this in rural areas of the Midwest, and my focus right now is in urban Cleveland, and we'll see where it goes from there. So a little bit about the historical context of Cleveland and Cape Town. Actually, they have a lot of similarities, although a lot of differences as well. But one thing to pay attention to is that histories of structural violence in both of these cities have had a permeating effect on current conditions and current health disparities that exist today. So without grounding the research within the historical context, it would be very difficult to actually get a deeper understanding of how well-being is being affected and influenced today. So many of you have probably heard about apartheid that happened in South Africa. It ended in 1994. So it's fairly recent, although they've had some time. But what happened during apartheid, and you can see here, this is a map of Cape Town during apartheid, and the residents of Cape Town, and actually the entire country, were segregated by racial classifications of white, Asian, Indian, colored, and black African. So these were the racial classifications that were given to groups of people, and that segregated them into neighborhoods where black African and colored residents especially were limited to neighborhoods where they lacked many resources to support their well-being. For colored families, they used to live very close to the city center. That was historically a colored community, up in the mountains, where they could grow lots of things, where they were close to work and education opportunities and things like that. And then they were forced to live in the Cape Flats area, which is very sandy and barren and far away from resources such as transportation and basic things such as having access to water, flushing toilets, things like that. And the same is true for the black Africans in the city of Cape Town. So while this has officially ended in 1994, we still see the same segregation happening across communities in Cape Town, and we also see health disparities mapped in the same way, where Black Africans and colored populations in Cape Town are experiencing the highest rates of infant mortality, dietary-related diseases, chronic disease, and a number of other health disparities. Similar conditions exist in our city. So this is a redlining map of Cleveland. And here's a quote actually to help support redlining. So we're residents of Cleveland. We're neighborhoods that were dominantly African American or comprised of Hispanic Latinx communities and other immigrant groups were marked or redlined as being the bad neighborhoods in the city, neighborhoods to not invest in. And so a quote from that to help distinguish what made a red neighborhood versus a green neighborhood, which is a nice neighborhood that you should invest in, is concentration of Negro population in the area is the heaviest in the city. Area is characterized by its heavy relief rolls, high disease and mortality rate, crime and unemployment. This is the most undesirable area in the city. So this is pretty explicit racism that happened in our city. And even today, we will see similarities when it comes to poverty levels, health disparities, infant mortality rates can be mapped over the same neighborhoods that were redlined. So I think we definitely had apartheid in our city as well, and we're feeling the effects still today. And so without recognizing that that's at the core of health disparities in our city, it's going to be difficult to move forward and to actually intentionally address this. So these are examples of maps where you can see life expectancy and poverty are still highly condensed in the same areas which were redlined, and they're also heavily populated by African Americans and Hispanic and Latinx people in our city. And this is very similar in South Africa. Here's a diagram of income disparities in South Africa. So you can see from during the apartheid era and post-apartheid, and you can see for Black and colored people in South Africa, very little has changed in terms of income disparities. You can see very little has changed in terms of whites owning the majority of the wealth in South Africa as well. And the white population in South Africa is actually just about 8% of the population. So the South African population is actually dominantly what people identify as Black African. It's over 80% Black African. So within Cleveland and South Africa, racial disparities are pronounced with infant mortality rates. So here in Cleveland, the Black infant mortality rate is 16 compared to the Hispanic Latinx rate, which is at 10.3, and the white rate, which is at 9.3. So that's deaths per 1,000 live births. You can see in South Africa, the Black infant mortality rate is 80, and the white is 13. So there are definitely disparities that are existing across even white populations in South Africa and the United States when it comes to health access and infectious disease and things like that. But there's a massive disparity in infant mortality rates in both contexts. So this is why the theoretical framework part of the theoretical framework that I ground my research in is that of structural violence, especially given the context where my research has taken place. So in social psychology, a definition I like to use of structural violence is any relation, process, or condition by which an individual or group violates the physical, social, and or psychological integrity of another person or group. And there's an additional social psychology public health definition that says that violence is a preventable social phenomenon. It is not an intractable social problem or an inevitable part of the human condition, rather a product of subjective and social factors. So I think, based on sort of the grounding of redlining and apartheid and current health disparities, this is very relevant. I've also taken a lot of interest in integrating the self and self-identity into our understanding of health and well-being. I think in psychology there's a very strong connection of how your sense of self and self-concept affects your mental health, but I think it actually is a huge part of our overall health and our overall well-being, and especially influenced by conditions of structural violence. So social conditions of structural vertical violence give rise to generations of interpersonal, and collective counterviolence, which permeates into social institutions, community structures, and relationships. So persistent messages, if you're a part of an oppressed group, of being worth less because of what you're surrounded by, can become internalized and affect your sense of self and affect your abilities to succeed and to be well in society, in addition to all of the other social and structural factors that are already affecting that. And so this could be part of the reason why neighborhoods of Cleveland and neighborhoods of Cape Town, who have been historically oppressed, continue to struggle with issues around community violence as well. Paulo Freire, who, if you haven't read Pedagogy of the Oppressed, it's an excellent book that really helps understand the impact that structural violence can have on a population, and also the need for global consciousness raising in order to break that. He says that horizontal violence is a part of the psychological state of people trapped by poverty and powerlessness, which we've seen in both of these contexts. Horizontal violence is a state of being victimized by vertical violence. So finally, to my study aim, this forms a part of the larger international study on children's well-being. It utilizes a child participation framework, and it explores, well, there's two studies here. Study 1 explored children's conceptualizations of the self and well-being within 2 urban communities of the Western Cape in South Africa. Additionally, the study aimed to develop children's recommendations for interventions, programs, and policies which promote health and well-being. And then the second study built off of this study, but it's now taking place in the Cleveland context. And this explores how children's health is shaped by the neighborhood environment, and how this influences their self-concept and overall well-being within 2 urban communities of Cleveland. And then it aims to develop children's recommendations for intervention programs and policies to promote health and well-being. And actually, the second study even takes it a step further, where I'm working with young people to develop an actual action plan supported by local community organizations that can kind of take their recommendations to the next step. And that requires a very kind of community participatory approach that goes a little bit further than what the first study did in South Africa. I'm mostly going to speak about the results of Study 1, because Study 2 is actually in the very early stages. We're about 1 month into data collection, so I don't really have too much to present on other than a little bit about the design. So for those of you who are not familiar with the child participation framework, it really recognizes children as valued collaborators, and it needs to pay attention to adult-child power dynamics as much as possible. It's very challenging when you're in academia, where these power dynamics are very embedded in our structures and in our policies and in our IRB processes and things like that. But there's definitely steps that we can take to make sure power is shared as best as possible. And children are really viewed to be knowledgeable actors and knowers, especially on issues related to their lives. A little bit about the South African research context. So this took place in 2 urban neighborhoods of Cape Town, South Africa. One neighborhood was developed for people classified as colored in South Africa. That's Lavender Hill. And the other neighborhood of Khayelitsha was developed for people classified as black in South Africa. They spoke 2 different languages in these neighborhoods. They had very different cultural makeup, and even structurally, the built environment was very different. Where Lavender Hill was a lot of similar housing to what we see in public housing in Cleveland, or the old public housing. We're making progress with our new housing developments, where like the flats, like highly condensed, highly populated apartment buildings and things like that, although many people still lived in shacks in Lavender Hill. And then Khayelitsha was kind of a sprawling informal settlement. So a lot of people came actually from rural areas and were building shacks out of scraps and things like that. Although initially houses were built for black South Africans during apartheid for some of them to live into when they were kicked off of their land. And they were very small and not very great housing, but then a lot of people didn't have a place to live, and they were only allowed to live in black communities, so they built shacks, and now it just continues to sprawl. And so this research kind of helped to capture a little bit of the diversity of the childhood experience that exists in Cape Town. The design was using focus group discussion, photo voice, community mapping, and the children's Delphi. This is the first time that a Delphi approach was used with children that I know of. A traditional Delphi is where you get together a group of experts, so typically people in academia or like clinicians, depending on the topic, and you go through several rounds on a particular intervention until there's agreement and consensus reached. So we trialed the Delphi with children, viewing them to be the experts on their lives and experiences. So it's a little bit of an innovative technique that we tried. The study also had a child reference group, so I had 5 children ages 10 to 12 from each community who were my co-researchers and collaborators throughout the process. They helped me design the questions, they helped me facilitate the groups with other children in their communities, and then we debriefed pretty regularly, and then they helped me thematically organize the results. And they were so essential to this research process. So the findings of this study, themes around childhood social connectedness in children's spaces were identified as key influences on a child's self-concept, their resiliency, and their overall well-being. And then there were 4 underlying discourses which emerged within the theme. So I did, on top of a thematic analysis, I did a discourse analysis as well to not only capture what was literally said, but the context in which it was said and what the meanings were behind that. And so these discourses were of a forfeited childhood, vulnerability and helplessness, preserving the integrity of the self, and opportunities for escape. And I'll explain those briefly. Okay, so for the first theme of childhood, one of the main things that came up is that children had this understanding, this ideological understanding of what it meant to be a child. I'm not sure exactly where that came from, potentially from media and from their interactions with more affluent groups in the city. But they knew that to be a child meant that you got to go to school, that you were protected, that your basic needs were met. And it really contradicted the reality that many of them were facing. And so they felt like they had this vulnerability as a child and this expectation that you're a child and therefore you can't do all these things. You can't vote, you can't work, you can't make decisions, you can't sign your own consent form for a research study. On the other hand, they were expected to actually take on all these responsibilities of adults, taking care of younger kids, fending for themselves, whether that's begging on the street or having a side hustle, and protecting themselves. Another theme was that of social connectedness. So it was really interesting to hear about how their identities kind of shifted in different social contexts, and I think that's pretty aligned with many social psychology theories around the self. But so for some children, these children here, they were involved in an after-school surfing program. And so that program really promoted pro-social behavior, and they had the support of people around them who were also engaging in that behavior. But they admitted that the behavior often didn't carry over when they left the program, because actually it was very difficult to survive in a neighborhood if you were showing soft interpersonal skills and things like that. You had to be hard, you had to be tough, or you'd be further victimized. So while we thought, maybe with this program, this is great, look at they're like changing their behavior and they're behaving so well and they're being nice to each other, that didn't always carry over, at least qualitatively from the interviews. And they also have talked about how they really sought out these social connections and how it really helped them to thrive, even if they weren't found in other environments. So for example, if children were in an abusive home environment, they did everything they could to seek out after-school programs. teachers in schools, friends, to help them kind of cope with that other environment. For other kids, if they were being bullied or victimized at school or in an after-school program, they found that comfort often in home, where they were supported. So they shifted a lot around their context, and they used social support a lot to kind of feel well, basically. The next theme is of children's spaces. So when they talked about different spaces in their neighborhood, it was largely constructed around their vulnerability within an unsafe space. So generally, they felt like their neighborhoods were not safe at all, and they were not fit for children. And so their idea of space was constantly about safety and strategies around safety. Good spaces included after-school programs in school and sometimes home, but it also, those very same environments were also bad spaces for some children, especially children who were being abused or bullied. And these are, the images here are all from the children, oops, sorry. The images here are all maps that the children drew as a part of our community mapping activity. So you can see that for most of the kids, the maps were pretty chaotic and consisted of a lot of violence. I would say that this one is kind of not the best image. I'm sorry, I keep pressing the wrong button. I don't know what I did. There we go. Okay, I keep pressing the wrong one. That one was probably the most positive, that young child. She was about 8 years old, and she had a really good home environment, and she really highlighted all the positive areas in her community really well, which I felt like the older children tended to focus even more heavily on the violence, and maybe they were just being more exposed to it, while the younger children were still being more protected from it. So now to talk about the discourses that emerged. The first one was of a forfeited childhood. So I want to read this quote in one of our focus group discussions. Do you see yourselves as children? And then the children almost all simultaneously said no. So it was pretty much consensus within this group that they do not see themselves as children. These are 8 to 12-year-olds. Why not? Because you can't even go out to play. So you're called maybe a child, but you're not living like a child. If you think of the word children or child, what does that mean to you? It means that you have the good life, and that I can go and play also. And also it could mean that I follow my parents and stuff, and I get a lot of time to go to school. So this is something that I spoke about earlier, but they seem to have this idea of childhood, kind of the idea of childhood that we sort of carry here in the U.S., but it really contradicted their reality for most of the children. Here's a quote related to the discourse of vulnerability and helplessness. So a female participant from the Kailicha community said, "To be a child to me is nice, because you have parents looking after you and keep you away from dangerous things like gangsters. For example, when they fight, they tell us to come inside at home. So it's nice to be a child, and you don't have to wake up and go to work. You just have to wake up, wash and go to school, eat before, and take your backpack and go." So this child came from a very supportive home environment where she felt like it was actually really nice. She saw her parents working really hard, and she thought she had a good life because her basic needs, at least, were really taken care of. But even in her explanation, she still mentions the strategy around violence. So the children in this study were constantly expending all of their energy around keeping themselves safe. So even for children who felt like they had like this supportive childhood environment, it was still constantly comparing it to the context of violence that they had to strategize around on a regular basis. How do you feel when people call you a child? And this participant, this was an 8-year-old from the same community, he said it hurts, and he started to cry. And I asked, is there space to be a child in Kailicha? It's not so nice to be a child because the older ones always beat you up and make fun of you in class and laugh at you. Also say bad stuff like you stink in the class and why don't you shower? So bullying is definitely something that children experience universally. And so for this child, his vulnerability and helplessness was really pronounced in his small stature. And also he was a part of a ethnic minority group in his community. So while This community was dominantly black. There were colored children that lived there, and same with the other community that was dominantly colored. There were black children that lived there, and so you did see this extra vulnerability by being a part of a minority population in a neighborhood, and those children tended to be more often bullied. You definitely saw, even though generally everybody was living below the poverty level, you also saw different hierarchies depending on how below you were living. So some of the children were really fending for themselves at the street, and they really struggled to integrate into the schools where children had access to a uniform or a place to shower or things like that. Here's one more quote that kind of captures a little different piece of vulnerability and helplessness. In our community, there's children, small my age, who are selling drugs to people. The gangster leaders who threaten them to sell this stuff. I see, so they're being threatened, so they don't even have a choice because they have to sell it. What else can they do? They kill them. They kill them if they don't do it. Wow, how do you think those kids feel about themselves? It makes them feel nervous. They feel nervous, and how does that make you feel? I feel sad for them. So the children showed a lot of empathy for each other and the situations of their peers, and they provided a lot of support for children who were in vulnerable situations. There was a very heavy gang presence in the community, which also created further vulnerability for the young people. Many of the children were forced into being a part of the gangs as the only way of staying safe. Like this boy said, that they didn't actually have a choice, and there were multiple reasons. I mean, first of all, it was for safety, but also being a child meant that you couldn't legally find a job or legally work, so many of these children had to look out for their own basic needs. And so that often meant begging on the street or joining a gang because the gangs would pay them money or pay them in food or in drugs. So it was kind of this inevitable trajectory that many of these children fell into in this environment. And then the last discourse that I'll speak about is opportunities for escape. So a male participant says, when I leave the house, I come mostly here. I feel quite good because I'm playing the marimbas, and when I go back home, I don't feel so good because of the fighting and stuff. But once I come back here, and then I feel so good, it may be like I'm going to the shop or somewhere, even if it's near here. As long as I'm away from the house, I feel good. Ah, okay, so different environments make you feel different ways, depending on who's surrounding you. Yes, other kids agreed. And then another child said, when I leave my house, then I feel happy. Like at school, my friends make me feel happy. They play games like soccer, and I will play with them and just enjoy myself. So children were continuously seeking out spaces that provided them with both physical and emotional safety, both within their communities and outside of their communities. But as I explained earlier, sometimes these positive ways of acting and engaging didn't always carry over into other environments where it was more functional to actually act hard, act aggressively, and defend yourself. Another form of escape that children often use was through fantasy. When I go to school, then I also feel very well, because when I'm at school, I learn also a lot of things, like playing soccer with my friends and everything. And there's a lot of stuff at school, like a bulletproof fence. At least that's what my friends say. I'm not sure if it's bulletproof, but my friends say it's bulletproof. I feel quite good knowing that it's bulletproof, because the shooting happens. Because if the shooting happens, it won't come through. And if I'm in school and they're shooting, the teachers will really look out for us. They call us and shout for us to come to class and run to class. So this participant knew that this fence wasn't bulletproof, and it wasn't bulletproof. It was just a fence. But the fantasy that he and his friends developed really did help them cope and maintain a sense of safety in a very unsafe environment. And this environment was chronically unsafe. Things could happen at any time, at any place. So children had to pull upon these different resources to protect them some sense of self and to be resilient in that environment, if that's what we want to call it, or just to cope. And so this also further shows just how the energy is constantly focused on maintaining safety. And then the last, I guess there was one more discourse, and that's preserving the integrity of the self. So the children's discourse has additionally highlighted children's strategies for resilience and coping, and also different defense mechanisms that they use to cope in an environment of chronic stress. So fantasy could be seen as one of those defense mechanisms. Also just desensitization. So this girl came from a rural area and explains her experience moving from a rural area to an urban environment. I feel bad in this area. It's like when you're sleeping at night, it's almost as if you hear the bullets go over to your head the whole time. It gives me bad dreams, and then I can't sleep at night, and I'm awake the whole night. Some nights I even get blackouts because I'm not used to this. Where I come from is a farm. It's so quiet there, and there's no shooting and stuff. The first time I came here, I heard the bullets. Then I asked my mother, "What is that, bullets?" She replied, "They shooting outside." And I just started crying, and I fainted in front of my mother. They called the ambulance. I have heart problems since I was small. Now I feel like I just want to get out of this area. I want to go to these. I used to enjoy myself there. I do not know of this, of what I know now. So you had a lot of nightmares because you were so afraid. Do you still have those nightmares? No, because I'm now used to it. So the children went through several rounds of the Delphi process. And they came up with agreed upon recommendations for programs, policies, and interventions that are aimed at improving children's well-being and their sense of self. And the number one thing that children agreed upon and emphasized was that good programs will make sure children are safe. So what I've seen in a lot of my work in the NGO sector and the nonprofit sector is that we really like to develop these evidence-based programs that are really great, and they're based on research, and we're learning new skills, and we have a toolkit for it, and it looks really, really awesome on paper. But sometimes the way it's delivered and the means that it's delivered and the context in which it's delivered makes a massive difference. And so if you're delivering that type of program in an environment where children are not safe, where you're not ensuring their safety, where you're not prioritizing their safety, then you might as well not have that program in the first place. So they spoke about that with some of the programs that they were in. Maybe they were getting this good psychosocial curriculum at the surfing program, which I developed, so I thought it was pretty good. But maybe it wasn't actually what they needed. Maybe that wasn't actually what they needed to support a healthy sense of self. And so safety, getting to the program, while they're at the program and when they're going home from the program. Same with school. So many kids didn't go to school. Part of the reason was they weren't safe getting to school or getting home from school. So programs really needed to look at that. Are you providing transportation? Are you walking with the kids? Do you have police or law enforcement involved if necessary, which in this context we probably could have used a police escort, would have been nice. In addition to safety, they really wanted opportunities to have fun and play with their friends. So sometimes I think we really undervalue just unstructured play and how good it can be for children and how valuable it is for their lives and well-being. Children are very structured all the time, especially in programs. It's very difficult to get support for programs unless you have a structured curriculum, even in South Africa. They wanted helpful, loving, and respectful people, especially adults. Then they started talking about the basic needs, so food at the program, a bed to sleep in if they feel sick, opportunities to learn new things that really help support a strong sense of self. If they could be challenged and learn these new skills like the marimbas or surfing or dancing, adult supervision, adults to teach children to respect each other, adults to play with them, activities like music, sports, dancing and singing, resources for school, opportunities to leave the community and experience new things, and animals. And the children actually found a lot of comfort in animals, and they found them to be very soothing, and many of them had animals that really helped them cope and they felt really safe with, and they felt like they could trust their animals. I also must add that I brought my dog to most of our sessions. She was very therapeutic for the kids, and so that may have been why they added animals. All right, and very briefly, because I'm running out of time, I'm going to touch upon Cleveland's study. So, like I said, it's in the early stages. It follows a very similar design, but me and the local community partners decided that we wanted to expand to include more youth in it. So we have two groups. We have the 8 to 12-year-old group, and then we have the 13 to approximately 17, 18-year-old group. So right now we're starting with the youth group. We have 10 youth. So it's a small sample, but it's qualitative. So remember that it's not meant to be generalized. It's meant to really gain insight into the in-depth experiences of young people. And so these two groups of 10 youth will go through the similar data collection processes, and then it's the idea that they will become the leaders of the study with younger children. So they will be trained to be co-researchers and to facilitate sessions with the 8 to 12-year-old group in the future, once they've already kind of been through the process, and then there would be further training to be a part of that. And so we have done some community mapping activities already. We did some visits to the Undesign the Red Line exhibit as well. So it's kind of happening very organically with community partners and within the context of what we need to add to the study and what we already have. The youth have also been exposed to various research designs, so they're also thinking through what else they would like to add to this study, and right now they're looking into adding an additional survey so they can reach out to more youth with questions that they prioritize. And that's basically where we're at the moment in Cleveland. So I don't really have any results to share with you, but it will also be a part of the data collected will contribute towards the international understanding of children's well-being study. And then just a little bit about the significance. I think that the study is unique and crucial in its aim to look at children's constructions of the self and their well-being and how this influences their health. It can inform interventions and policies which seek to improve community child well-being, promote mental health, and reduce community violence. It informs theory and practice in child psychology, child studies, and public health. And it supports children as valid research collaborators. The children in this study were absolutely amazing. They blew me away, even the 8-year-olds, their insights, what they were able and capable to contribute to this study. And then future directions, I think similar studies need to be done in other contexts and across different socioeconomic, racial, ethnic groups and age groups. So I'm hoping that this additional study will also bring the youth voice into research, although I will say part of the reason for initially selecting early childhood is that there is a large body of youth research out there and youth participatory action research called YPAR. It has been heavily utilized. Not that there's not still a need for it. It's an amazing process, but middle childhood children have been largely excluded from what we know and from those research processes. And here's my contact information should you want to reach out to me. There's a number of articles published on this work as well. I'm happy to share those, and a lot published on the Children's World study as well. Okay.
Should we open it up to questions?
Yes, please. Sarah.
I run a program in the community, often very considered unsafe neighborhoods. And I guess, I know that you were doing a similar grassroots program, your surfing program in South Africa. What did you do? How did you navigate the safety factor in that program? And do you have any recommendations for what you learned for other people doing similar work?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So some of it was in the training, so if it was safety at the program. So in addition to my research, I worked a lot with local NGOs in South Africa to help them develop programs and around like children mental health promotion. So it was a lot of training of the people running the programs who were often community residents who didn't have access to all the formal training in child psychology that I've had access to about how to keep kids safe in that space, how to be emotionally available for kids. So like that emotional safety aspect, how do you listen to children? How do you show empathy? Things like that. And then also just around supervision and that importance, because a lot of bullying was happening when adults weren't really paying attention or weren't there to supervise or help kind of guide kids to stand out for themselves. So some of that programming incorporated aspects of that. So that was within the program, this understanding of supervision, supporting kids to advocate for themselves, and then just how to be emotionally available for kids. And then outside of the program, it was things around some community-based approaches, like walking the kids to and from the program. I mean, in an area where there's a lot of shooting, they can't totally be safe. No, none of us could be 100% safe, but the kids were a lot safer if adults were walking with them from the school to the program. So kind of advocating for even shifting budgets to like pay community men who are safe, like some of the fathers in an area that where unemployment was super high, to pick up the kids from school and to walk with them to the program. We were able to provide transportation for one of the programs. They were able to budget for a van to bring the girls because girls were actually like commonly being raped, even young girls, as young as the girls we were working with on the routes to and from the program. So at least we saw them as actually being the most vulnerable. The boys could defend themselves a little more easily. So, but shifting like that, the funding priorities, I think, were really important in that context of like, yes, this part of your program is really important, but it's not if kids aren't safe coming to and from this program. And that was kind of hard for some of the organizations because they wanted to show that their programs were very cost effective, but transportation is not very cost effective. I mean, I think it's effective if children are staying safe, but from like a cost benefits economic analysis of a program.
I really like that idea of paying the men to walk with them.
Yeah, and it's community
like a little economic
based.
Stimulation.
Yeah, exactly. Go ahead.
Have you had challenges, or any other of the countries, have they had challenges in getting the research approved and incorporating the child within the research?
Yes, I have had challenges as well. That is definitely something that we, as a part of a larger network, we have consistent dialogue around, and even something I'm currently struggling with in my study design. It's very difficult to recognize the children as co-researchers because they can't actually be approved as co-researchers through our IRB because they can't consent other people and they can't consent for themselves. So that's, I think, part of the challenge with it. They're still viewed as a vulnerable population, so I think IRBs are very just careful about how you engage vulnerable populations in research, and sometimes it's not as specific as it could be to the study or the context. So I'm working with a lot of other researchers on trying to figure this out, and also trying to figure out sort of my blind spots, because I feel like there's so many benefits to including kids as co-researchers, but what am I overlooking? And I mean, one thing I can say is the protection of the children. So you're doing this research and then children expose some very vulnerable information, and then other children might spread that information, where as a researcher I'm very accountable to many other people to keep that information safe. So can you get children to actually do that? That definitely can be seen as a challenge, but at the same time, they're living in the real world. So for example, if youth were to go out and survey other youth, they're already on Instagram and Facebook and Snapchat, and their information is publicly available all the time, and they're constantly engaging with each other in very big discussions, but in research they can't survey other youth around issues important to them. So it's challenging. It really is, trying to weigh out the very real potential vulnerabilities, but also empower young people at the same time. And then also the context. So like in South Africa, I don't want young children to have to work, but in an environment where their basic needs are not being met, I kind of wish they legally could, because I think that would keep a lot of them out of the gangs or off the streets. But they can't, because there's laws, international laws, local laws, national laws against it. So it's kind of the same in research. In some contexts it doesn't make sense. It is challenging when you're trying to empower children and then they can't even consent for themselves to be in it. And what if they want to be in it and the parent says no? That's disempowering, right? So it's hard. It's challenging. Any other questions?
In South Africa, you had two separate groups.
Yes.
In Cleveland, you just got the African American community or the Hispanic community?
It's the Hispanic community as well. So I didn't go into too much detail about the community. So I'm working in Clark Fulton and Central, and so Clark Fulton is almost 50% Hispanic. So so there we have a large Hispanic representation in that community. So that kind of helps to also capture a little bit of the diversity of the experience of young people in Cleveland. And then Central is dominantly African American. Actually, 100% of our youth in the Central sample are African American.
But you will have some blacks in the Hispanic community that will be a minority, as you had with the colored and with the black Africans. Will you have some Hispanics in the black community that will be minorities? To see maybe
in this current sampling, we haven't, but maybe as we reach more children in the next phase, like of the younger children, and because it's going to be a larger sample size too, we might have more representation, but it really was like a voluntary thing, and so we really only had, it wasn't like random sampling or anything, or like purposive sampling in that way of where we were like purposely including these diverse people within the community. It was like, who wants to be a part of this? And so we only had African Americans sign up in Central. But it's something to consider and acknowledge, you know, that that's why the context of qualitative data collection is so important, and understanding, you know, that this is a very small sample of children and we can really only understand their perspectives and not generalize it to the larger community. But that's a really great point, and I hope that we get more diversity in our sample in the next phase. Go ahead.
Great talk, thank you. I'm just curious if you've been able to talk with any of the local politicians in Cape Town about some of what you guys have found, because it seems like, you know, there's a certain amount of money that could go into individualized mental health care, I don't know, fixing roads, whatever it is, but clearly there are some potential policy ideas that could flow out of.
Absolutely. So my mentor, who was a research collaborator on this study, he's very active in translating the findings from our work into policy. So that's one avenue. For me, while I was still in South Africa, we did a lot of presentations of the findings. So sometimes it was with the kids, sometimes it was just me, depending on certain contexts. The kids didn't want to present, they didn't feel comfortable, they wanted me to present for them. So I think that's really important. It can be really empowering for the kids, it can also be really disempowering. And so we presented with some local politicians, law enforcement, we had like two community presentations, and then we presented at the different schools too in the area so that teachers could learn about some of these findings. And we actually had like a community friendly report that we distributed, and then we presented at different like grassroots organizations too. And then after that, I provided additional training and support for the organizations to help them kind of integrate some of this and some of the other social emotional aspects that I was knowledgeable about into their programs. In this context, South Africa follows, in theory, a very similar social system structure of like social work referrals, and they have clinical psychologists and counselor referrals. But in these areas, you can refer and you will never, ever, ever see somebody or hear from somebody. Also, dominantly white professions, not speaking the native languages, culturally not relevant at all, like what is this psychotherapy, no way am I consenting to that. So mental health promotion was something I felt very passionate about, like how can we help communities to be able to promote the social and psychological well-being of their children, and not be dependent on outsiders to come in. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.